Hi, everybody. Welcome. This is Barbara Miller from Museum of the Moving Image. In these past few weeks, we've been bringing you programs that we're calling MOMI at Home. Tonight is another event in our Jim Henson's World Conversation series. And we are so fortunate to have three guests with us who are each instrumental in bringing Jim Henson's beloved puppet characters to life. Puppet builders Caroly Wilcox, Bonnie Erickson, and Rollie Krewson. We look forward to welcoming you to MOMI in person when we reopen. In the meantime, we'll continue to bring you events like this one, along with a lot of other great content. Please just head over to our website, movingimage.us. And as you know, this event is free, but we sincerely hope you'll be inspired to support the museum by making a donation in whatever amount you are able, so we can continue to bring you events like this one and get ready to open our doors as soon as it is safe to do so. Just a couple of quick things. Please feel free to use the Q&A feature that you'll see on the screen to pose questions throughout the event. Karen Falk, Archives Director at the Jim Henson Company and Vice President of the Jim Henson Legacy, is behind the scenes and will answer your questions directly. And she will feed us a few questions that we can answer on the air towards the end of our discussion. So the guests joining us tonight each spent many years working with Jim Henson, Jim Henson's company, mostly designing and building puppets in what is now known as the Jim Henson Creature Shop. Let us bring in our guests, Caroly Wilcox, Bonnie Erickson, and Rollie Krewson. Welcome. Hi, Bonnie. Hi, Rollie.
Hi there.
Hello. Hi, Barbara.
Nice to see you, and hi, Caroly. It is a distinct pleasure to have all of you here with us tonight. Give me 1 second. Okay. I think the first thing that we want to do is hear a little bit from each of you to hear about how you got involved with the company, how you came to be a puppet builder. You know, it was not like there was a track for that, you know, out there in the world. So I'm really interested in hearing your stories. I know our audience will be hearing your stories of how you came to this field. But before we get started, I will say that this may be a sort of historic occasion. I'm not sure that the three of you have been gathered before as a group to talk about this.
Nope.
It's just such a thrill.
It's great.
Really, really great. So Caroly, since you were the first to start working with the company, maybe you can say a little bit about what brought you to start working with Jim Henson. And as we do that, I'm going to show some pictures too.
Yeah. Well, I joined in 1969, which is when they started taping. But before that, I had done floundered around doing all sorts of other things with other companies, even local CBS children's show. And then I read that Joan Cooney was starting to do the show. I said, oh, I've done puppets, I'll do puppets. And then I learned that Jim was doing it. And I said, oops. So then I tried out with Jim. But Jim is a master of ad-lib puppeteering, and the puppeteering I had done was with rod puppets, was physical, but I can't talk. I can't ad-lib talk. So I wound up working in the shop because I was good with crafts, and so that I stayed on working with Jim after that.
So you originally thought that you were maybe going to be working with him as a performer and kind of start?
No, he wanted performers, so I tried out that way, but you know, I just wasn't at it. I did puppeteer when there were crowd scenes. I was one of 20 or 30 people, or 200 like the finales of some of the movies, but basically I've done it.
And when you started, the company was still very, very small. It was really when Sesame Street
Don Celine,
everything blew up. So when you started, the only other builder there with the company was Don. You see his picture there.
Don,
you guys can even say something about
designer.
that.
He built the first Ernie and Bert and a lot of other things. He loved doing sort of ugly creatures too. And he did a lot of silly things too. Well, one thing was when Bonnie brought over with Wade's mice from, and Don would have them run all over the workshop, and there were a lot of silly events like that.
Bonnie,
they weren't Twinkies.
Yes,
I want to make it clear.
Slinky.
Yeah. Bonnie's background was costume.
Yeah.
I remember that she was doing costume for the Me or something, the kids, a teenage musical performers. But her costume, she was like earning 5 cents an hour. I mean, at the beginning, right, Bon?
A little more than that, Caroly, but probably not much.
Bonnie or Rollie, do you want to share a story about Don Celine? And I guess I'm staying on that for a minute because I think in some ways Don, because he was the first puppet builder to work with Jim, you know, the first one to build puppets for Jim that Jim and Jane didn't build on their own, that his work really set the stage for everyone that came after. And I think also from the stories that I've heard, set the stage for a certain kind of environment and humor that I think still pervades the shop. Do either one of you want to share?
I'd love to talk about it because he was really my mentor. Caroly as well, but Don, I do have a funny story about starting work there. Jim put me at Don's table, and Don was sort of territorial, so he was a little nervous about somebody else sitting at his table. I didn't know this. I sat down, I was starting to do sketches. My first job was with Frog Prince and doing the costumes, as Caroly said. And so there was this big sphere of foam rubber on the end of the table. It was like a head with a bunch of feathers sticking out of it. It was very bizarre looking. And I kept looking at it out of the side of my eye. I kept thinking I saw it move. And then I'd look at it and it'd be perfectly still. I looked at Don. He's busy with both hands doing stuff. And about the third time, I finally reached over and grabbed it. It was tied to a string that went drilled through the table to an eye hook in the floor and then up to Don's foot, so that he was doing that just to see if he could get me. That was my introduction to Don Celine and the playfulness really of the workshop.
Yeah, Mike, I always had to worry about Monday morning because, I mean, I'm an early bird and I've always been an early bird. So when I would come into the shop, I would be the one that had to unlock the elevator. There were 2 doors, so I'd unlock one and then, you know, push the other one open. And Don always had something waiting for me. Like, you know, you'd trip a line and a little ball of fluff would go shooting off somewhere, or, you know, there was something would turn around with a monster on it, and you know, it was like, ah.
So the fun and the pranks were not just on the screen; they were behind the scenes.
Absolutely.
Oh yeah. We had a lot of fun.
So Bonnie, here's a picture of you. I think it was probably soon after you started. Do you want to say a little something about that?
Well, the first job was, as I said, a Frog Prince, and I came in just as a freelancer to do the costumes for it. But I had an art background and I had sculpture background, and starting to play around some of the shapes when Jim was in need of something quickly for one of the variety shows or something. But this was the first thing where he let me design the characters, the humanoid characters. And so this is the Muppet Musicians of Bremen, which was taped up in Toronto. And that's us on the set. And just so that you know, the character on the left with the bare knees sort of showing is Jim. And Caroly, I think you're the next person.
Yeah.
And
I worked on making
Good.
them, but I when they were full-body characters, I was inside the costume. I wasn't. When they
Right.
were half-body, the puppeteers were puppeteering the top.
Yeah, we did 2 sets. We did puppeteerable heads, and then the actual costumes so we could really do long shots with humans in it.
Yeah. Do you have a picture of us in the flocking outfits?
Yes, I do. I can show you that.
This was a new method that Jim had discovered, and we started flocking everything we could. This is Caroly and me. We found out very early on that if you're using an electrostatic flocking machine, the flock will go to your eyes, to your clothes, everywhere. And we soon discovered that we had to really dress up in order to do any of the flocking. You can see we're flocking hands there for, I think, probably the Muppet Musicians of Bremen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Lots of on-the-job hazards. Here's another one. Slightly less protected. I want to go back and also talk about Rollie's entry into this, and I'll just say as a little bit of context that that you all started at different times, but they were within a few years of each other. So Caroly, you joined the company in 1969, right when Sesame Street was getting off the ground, and Bonnie, you came in
1970.
a year later. And Rollie, you started a few years after that when you must have been 8 years old.
And
a little older than that. I was in my senior year at Denison University, and I started there as an apprentice or an intern. Right. And it was a special program, and I actually had been interning for someone else, and I couldn't continue that because she was moving to being a newscaster, but her husband was working with Jim on the Broadway show that Jim was working on at that point. And Judy said to me, you know, I can get you. She knew that I had done one puppetry course in college. And she knew that I had had a really good time doing it. So she said, oh, my husband's working with Jim Henson, you know, I can get you an interview. So and then that's what happened. And I interviewed with actually Diana Birkenfield, and then went to the shop and met Bonnie and Caroly and Don. And basically they said, just look around, make yourself at home. They were great to me. I had such a fabulous time as an intern.
You know,
We're happy to have her.
It's interesting to hear about, because this was not the kind of work that you all did was not something that you could read a textbook for and just follow along with what you're supposed to do. It must have been a lot of sort of learning on the job and collaborating and mentoring and learning from each other. Can you guys say a little bit about that spirit of collaboration and what it was like to all work together?
I don't think anything ever left or became a completed puppet without everybody sort of asking colleagues what they thought for comments or help. Caroly built a lot of costumes for puppets that I did. I built costumes for some of the things in Sesame Street, but that was not my main thing. Fizzakis, who was really the genius with all of the electrical and the remote control pieces and things that we did, came in, and whenever we needed to have something that animatronic, we'd go there. Don helped with a lot of the mechanical things as well. Everybody shared. It was a really, it was a fantastic group of colleagues working together, and all of us sort of in the same place in our lives. It was terrific.
I want to I guess just go back a little bit and ask kind of a basic question about what it means to design and build a puppet. Like if you could sort of describe what your jobs were, when for you, Rollie, because you're still there, do you consider yourself builders? Do you consider yourself designers? And what is the distinction between the two?
Who gets to go for Bonnie? Go.
No, go ahead, Rollie, because you are still there doing this over many years.
Well, It's interesting. I'm much more of a hands-on three-dimensional designer. I do design, I do three-dimensional designs. I'm not that great with drawing.
Me too.
I certainly can draw, but that's not, I usually like to do things, you know, make mock-ups of things. But it is a very collaborative process. I mean, we do get the puppeteers in. Hopefully they get to put their hands in the puppet before they actually have to put it on TV. That's always important. Jim was always into movement, and that's Twitch from Bunny Picnic. And like her hair, there's all sorts of movement, and the closeness to your hand was a thing that Jim really liked.
So if you're not working from a sketch, right, then how do you know what to build? Like how much freedom did you all have in terms of, you know, like what kind of instruction did you get, and then what was your sort of invention process like?
Well, Jim's sketches were just like little thumbnail sketches, and Michael Frith's were much more fleshed out, but Jim got an essence of what he wanted in just a few lines. So that, to me, I had a hard time in the beginning learning what he wanted, but once I got it, it was like, oh, this is it. I've got it. I understand.
Right.
Yeah, so sometimes, like was it Saturday Night Live, the creatures there, the Jerry was doing Scred, and you had to start with the hand of the performer because the layer on top was so skinny. You couldn't do a fat foam thing and have it move as well. So you'd start with the hand and see what the hand of the puppeteer was doing, and then just add more and make it work that way. So that's a different approach, sort of. Depends on the character.
Yeah, well, Scred was fabulous. I mean, just
Yes.
the movement he could get was remarkable.
So Rollie, you were saying that you don't do a lot of sketching of puppets before you build. Sometimes you'll refer to others. I know for Sesame Street, sometimes when you're building extras for Sesame Street, it's really just a line in a script, and then you're off and running. But for some other puppets, there were sketches to work from. We'll start with this one because I know people are going to want to hear about Elmo, Caroly.
Well, yeah,
so can you tell
go
me,
Caroly.
There, Elmo. This is something else. There were a group of, they had written a song about a fat blue puppet and a green puppet and stuff, and they wanted to say, this puppet is not like the other because it's such and such. So Elmo was little red puppet. And then we had a fat round blue one. So that was fat blue. And they had there's tall ones sort of pumpkin colored. So each one had a different quality. And they'd sing a song about this and why they were different. And so they could always compare them in several different ways. But so Elmo was just a little one with sort of a wide mouth and no body really, because they were made quick. They didn't. And then people started playing with it. I've forgotten, Brian, somebody or other, was one person to play Elmo.
I think Richard Hunt was puppeteering him in the beginning as well.
Yeah. And it became Kevin Clash, of course, who was brilliant, but he must have had kids that he could listen to, because he was the one that invented the idea, Elmo do something or other, instead of I will do it or me go. It was Elmo do it. And so that got that quality. But then they would write scripts for him, so I would add a body and a little bum and functional legs that could kick, and he could sit on a table. and do things, you know, instead of just being the short little hint of the puppet. I mean, that happened with a lot of characters. They would develop more.
Right.
Yeah.
I want to stay on Elmo for a second and get to this, dig in also a little bit more to this notion of collaboration and the sort of culture at the shop, because I know that that in the room where you are sitting right now, Rollie, and we won't necessarily bring him on as a guest, but there is an Elmo puppet where you are, and I know that that you sort of took over in the late '80s. Building Elmo puppets, and I'm assuming took over from Caroly. So
Yes.
what was that process like of sort of passing the torch, or is there a story there in terms of turning the responsibilities over from one designer to another?
I think that Caroly, were you still there then? I think.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, because I'm trying to, you know, Caroly worked on a different floor than I did. She was on 5. So I'm not quite sure how I got to do Elmo, but I've been doing him since '87.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
I still using your patterns.
Yeah.
I'm
So, well, there.
the fur has changed, because he was that sort of candy floss red fur, and he just wore out too quickly. So we've changed the fur, but all the patterns are the same. I mean, down to it's your handwriting on them.
That's a bummer when the fabric changes. It's
It's really
Kermit
hard.
the Frog. Kermit the original. Well, the original Kermit was sort of a lizard with the supposedly Jane's coat. But then we found this beautiful fleece, which was very dense and sturdy, and about 1/4 of an inch thick, and great. And then that was gone, and we were trying to find other fleece that would do it, and it was usually thinner. And sometimes we had to do a double layer of thin fleece to reproduce the same dimension of the character, or you changed the body of the character a little bit fatter, so you use a thin fleece and the fatter body to keep the same size. Big Bird is an example of.
I was just thinking of that.
Mm.
Yes.
Yeah, Big Bird. Kermit Love was a great costumer, but he was a feather man. Loved working with feathers. The original Kermit was hackle pads. It was sort of sad looking, but then they got the idea of the turkey feathers. The turkeys were big, long, white feathers because people used to eat big turkeys at Thanksgiving. So they were long.
We can't get big turkey feathers anymore.
I told Jim he should buy a turkey farm.
I know.
And then they got so that they were 11 inches or something. They were about 6 or 7 inches, which meant that the bodies of bird had to be made a little bit larger so that the outside dimension of Big Bird was same as it had been originally.
And the heads too.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Kermit kept changing it. The original bird was a little bit ratty looking if you look at Jim's sketch, the original sketch. And Kermit was the one who fluffed the hell out of it and made him look more childlike. Also, the bigger pupils, which is softer and more childlike and things like that. And
Bonnie, let's get to a story of a sketch to puppets. One of your stories. So this is a sketch that that you made for
Is that all that's left of it?
the 2 old men. Well, it was conserved after this. So it's much more stable now. But this is was
Wow.
it at some point. Well, you know what I mean. The other thing is, as you guys know, few, if anything, you created was meant to last for the ages, right? The sketches were just on scraps of paper, and even the puppets,
The puppets were just
used
for a show
until they fell apart. So it's up to us at the museums to keep these things.
right.
But you want to tell us a little bit about this sketch and what it was made for at the time?
Sure. I really consider myself more of a designer. I coming from that sort of background. I was not a puppeteer, for which Jim was always grateful. And I did a lot of sketching before I started, except when I did Miss Piggy. I did not do that. I did what Rollie did. We started with material. But with these guys, Jim was very kind and sent me home in a taxi if we worked really late, which happened occasionally. And I used to have to go around Grand Central Station, and I would look down into the Yale Club, and I would see these big portraits on the wall. And I had this image of these guys sitting there, you know, having their cognac and their cigar. And I did a sketch, and I brought it in and I showed it to Jim, and he liked them, but he said, you know, we really don't have any need for anything like that. But he took the sketch, and I think it was maybe a year later when we were doing, I think it was Sex and Violence was the first show that they appeared in. So he came to me and he said, I think it's time to build these guys. So there's Waldorf as he was just being completed. And I have to say, this was a collaboration too, because I built the bodies and I did sculpt the heads and created that shape, but it was Christopher Lyle, who now lives in New Zealand, who was a master tailor who did the costuming for both the guys, which I've always just loved. I thought they were beautiful.
Oh, it's gorgeous.
But I will say that I had sort of started this whole carving method of foam, and at the very end, after scissoring everything, very tiny scissors, I would go up and smooth them out on a bandsaw. And I took the Statler up, his nose was on, his ears were glued, his eyes were in place. I just had one little thing that needed to be fixed. I lost my concentration for 1 second, and it went through the sander and over to the wall on the other side with a hole through the whole head. So I did what Don would do. I went up to the roof.
You don't want to keep that kind of image in your mind. That's a very big image in your mind.
So I went up to the roof of the building and I took a bunch of terracotta pots and I threw them. I felt a lot better, and I came back and started all over again. But they're a couple of my favorite characters because they had such a funny beginning.
Do you remember when I did that to the Newsman?
Yes, I do.
Was that a puppet? A newsman?
The Newsman.
Not an actual newsman?
Not an actual newsman. No, I mean, I really like to do the sanding on the sander, and Bonnie had done the Newsman, and she said, could you just go up and sand it off for me? And I got his lip, and there was no time to do another one. So I think the first one went on with a little, he was very funny. In his lip.
We were all very forgiving.
I didn't throw anything. I cried in the stairwell.
Oh, Rollie, I'm sorry to hear that. Throwing's much better. Oh my gosh.
I'd like to hear from you guys a little about in the process of making these puppets come to life. I know certainly throughout the 70s and well into the 80s, Jim was still very, very hands-on in the shop. And I'd love to hear some stories from you all about how he got involved in sort of checking the puppets and the kind of feedback that you got from him.
Oh, he would, even when I was in charge of the shop, keeping everybody's schedule and doing sort of research on materials and stuff, Jim was always there sort of to make rounds and would go and visit everybody who was doing things. He was on top of everything because, of course, he saw it from the beginning. In the beginning was the word. So the scripts were there, and that's what would sort of inspire the next characters to be done. This picture here has Jim in the shop at 2:25 we were always, the Henson Company for many years was always in sort of the same general area on the Upper East Side. This is Don Celine in the very front, and he's working on, what's the name of the?
Gosh Posh.
Gosh Posh, right. And Foz back in the corner there.
Is it Gosh?
And Jim working with me on the Jerry Nelson puppet that I did. There were all these caricatures that I had designed, and Don had built the Jerry puppet. So he would come in to the studio. At that point, he had an office right upstairs. So he was always in the building. He was always there. He had final judgment on everything that we did at that point. And I remember one day after we'd moved to the mansion, was it? No, we were at 201, which was in the same block. But he had done promotional photographs that they were sending out because he was starting to be very well known. And when he came in, everybody at their desk had the picture of Jim, and they had signed their own pictures saying, "You are the best puppet builder I've ever known, and Jim Henson, thank you so much." And we had them all facing him as he came off the elevator. He was wonderful. He encouraged us to play, which is how a lot of these things came about.
I still have that picture.
It was a great photo.
Here's an image of you, Caroly, with Jim and another colleague, and it looks like he's in maybe what was sort of typical of him, his position of considering work that someone else did. What was some feedback that you got, Caroly? And you were there very early on, before there was a large coterie of builders, so you must have worked really closely with him in those early days when it was just you and Don and some others in the shop.
I'm trying to figure who that guy is. Anyway, the character I don't remember. The one thing that was interesting about Jim, we would be working very late to try to get something done, and even 11 o'clock at night. And he would come into the studio, and he said with his hands like this and say, "Oh, you're working so late. You know why?" "Yeah, we're working late. We're trying to get it done. We want it ready for tomorrow." Yeah, he would sometimes change things, but what was great, we would do our damnedest, and it might not be exactly what he wanted. Probably wasn't exactly what he wanted, but he was able to take it and work with it and run with it and make good theater. And that was fabulous. And it made us feel better, because we sometimes we're delighted with our results, but we tried so hard.
I've never asked this question, but I'm curious to know, like, when Jim started working with Jane, with his wife, building puppets and performing them in the mid-50s, it was Jane and Jim that were designing and building puppets together. There was nobody else until the first years into the 1960s, when Don Celine came on.
Yeah.
So did Jim continue to build at all, or was he hands-on of making?
Yeah.
We did one of the first things that I did with the carved foam was an experiment that he was doing with a character called, it was for the Ed Sullivan Show, and it ate a small version of himself, of course.
Mm-hmm.
I just can't remember what the name of the character was, but it was all carved out of solid foam. And it came because he wanted to experiment with new materials. That was one of the times when Caroly said they had run out of the fleece fabric that had been used, and everybody was scrambling to try and find something else. And at that time, Jim was also playing with shapes and soft things that would move easily, which sort of inspired the rest of my work doing all the sculpted pieces.
For the Ed Sullivan Show, we had a great big guy with a big mouth, and I went to the West 40s and bought the spaghetti, which was like 4 feet long, We boiled the spaghetti because he was eating and eating spaghetti for this bit. I forget what the bit was about, but he did things like that.
I'm
No.
trying
Yes,
to remember the
sounded like
name.
you had another a story to share.
I remember that when I remember Jim doing something with the Swedish chef. I think
He
you
did.
finished him off, but didn't
Yeah.
you start him?
He did. He did the first carving, first
Yeah.
part of the carving, and then handed over to me because he got very busy at other stuff. But no, and that was very late in the time
Yeah.
that we were being puppets for Muppet Show and for specials and things like that. So he was still very involved.
Yep.
No, he loved building.
Yeah, he
Even at
did.
Christmas, he and his family would make things like decorations and stuff.
Yeah,
which
I
we
still
would
have
get
a
gifts.
bread dough ornament.
And
from
I
him
have,
from-
yeah, me too, me too. No, he loved the making part of it. He was an amazing person in terms of the skills sets that he had. And even when I left and started my own business, much of his business acumen and the way he dealt with the characters and the designs he done were things that I took with me. Amazing man, and really did, I think, mean what he said when he wanted to leave the world a better place.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah.
And here we are. Why is it not better?
Well, keep
One
working
thing
at it.
also, I
New York
think,
strong.
was the humor was silly. This is one thing I especially like is that it was never, especially the Swedish chef and the doodly boopy boops, but he never was nasty humorous. A lot of people do humor that's nasty. This was always silly, ridiculous, and wonderful. And some of the bits would fall, but when they were good, they just shone. You know.
Well, there's a reason why we're sitting here talking about it, all these years later, and the sort of amazing fact, not to age any of us, but it sort of occurred to me this morning that you all started at the shop about 50 years ago.
Yeah. Oh, please. Well, even then we were calling Jim the gentle anarchist. And it really was a space where we all felt safe. We bought into all these worlds that he was creating. It was a very special place and time to be involved there. When I started, there were probably 6 or 7 of us, including the receptionist. And by the time that I left after the first Muppet Show, there were about 30 people, and then not counting the staff that was in England that really bumped things up big time.
So at that point, it's interesting that you raised that, Bonnie, because I'm curious to talk a little bit about that, and I'll share the screen again, and I want to look at this picture of the shop in London. So when the Muppet Show started, so there was a thriving shop in New York where Sesame Street and all these other things were done, but then the Muppet Show was produced in England, and
Right.
it required a shop there. Was there first the idea that it didn't need to be a shop in England, that everything would just get shipped, or was there
Oh,
always
no.
a plan for a shop?
No, it was always meant to have a shop. We had to have a shop there. And this is the room which was right off the studio, so that we had access, and we would work the shoot to make sure nobody ever waited for a puppet or whatever. All the building and stuff was done there. And then we had a lot of stuff that was built in New York and sent over to us as we needed, if the timing was okay. But when we found out that Lord Lou Grade at the time was making a deal with Jim to be able to shoot everything at his studio at Elstree, we packed up everything we could find, everything that we could think of that wasn't Sesame Street, and took it over for the show, so we'd have a bunch of things available depending upon what the writer was going to write. We also had staff in England that worked with us, so there was a collaboration there, and they were wonderful.
Did you all spend time in England working on the Muppet Show?
I went for 6 weeks and ended up staying for like 5 or 6 years.
Right, I was there for the first year.
And what about you, Caroly? Because you were most
I would go for about a month for a special project, yeah.
Mhm.
Back and forth, carting boxes, signing in.
Mhm. Quite an operation.
We would get first class from New York to England.
They're very nice.
And work, and then we were going back. But anyway, that was good.
About patterns. Can you just talk a little bit about how patterns for each puppet are made, and who's responsible for making them, and do they change over time? It's just the real nitty-gritty of the making, I think, is something that most people don't have a real clear sense of. Can you guys talk a little bit about that?
I think everyone who came into the shop initially, when I was there, when we were all there concurrently, could make patterns. Rollie may not have started out doing it, but she certainly became the best pattern maker I know of. Caroly made a lot of patterns. I made patterns. I came in, of course, from three-dimensional clothing and special effects kinds of things. So, and I think other people who were there, if they were there to do costuming and puppets, were able to do patterns for anything we needed. And I think that probably is still true today. I don't know, Rollie, you'd have to.
Yeah, it's definitely true. Although, I mean, we have to teach some people as they come in how to do the foam patterning.
Right.
And patterns do change, or people will make, I mean, there are still envelopes that say keep, but do not use. It's like, oh, really? Okay. And then you go through and you have to find the starred patterns, or or the pattern that has the last date that somebody used it. Is this it or not? I mean, Sesame, a lot of times we're doing things so quickly that a lot of times we don't have time to make really good patterns, or you think you've made good patterns and you haven't. And then somebody else has to build what you built. And then they're going, why did you do it this way?
Well, but it is interesting that everybody would keep copies of the patterns. Yeah. We were very good about that, and marking them with instructions on each pattern piece on how it was to be put together, and then saving it, and like many of them, keeping them in the archives so they were able to be used later.
Yep.
I was having, when we were reproducing a whole bunch of characters for the next movie, I was having trouble getting people to work with calipers and keep them sized down, because it was so easy for them to creep up that 1/8 inch in size, and Ralph would get a little bit bigger, a little bit softer. And so you had to really keep it down to have them look as they always used to.
So I'm curious about this also, because obviously there had to be consistency between the puppets, and they had to stay the same over time, and that's very important. But there's also the influence of the puppeteer on how puppets were made, because especially with a puppet that was deeply connected to a particular puppeteer, did they have an impact on how things were constructed because of their own comfort? Can you all share a story about working with a puppeteer in partnership to kind of adjust the design, either externally or internally, or both, for a puppet?
Well, I can address that a little bit, because the puppets that I was starting to do were the soft foam puppets, which were very different than the ones that had the hard palette. And so puppeteers found very early on that they had to sort of tamp down the actions that they made, because it was so squishable, some of these characters, that they weren't always getting the expression they wanted. So they were incredible in turning them into things where, for instance, Miss Piggy never opens or closes her eyes, yet when Frank Oz is doing her, she's pouting, she's angry, she's happy, she's I mean, she's all those things, and yet the eyes are never closing. So you have to work with the puppeteer to make sure it fits the hand, and that it's really easy to manipulate because it's that's their vehicle. This is, you're there to serve the puppeteer's ability to maneuver this puppet properly.
Do you have a particular story about Frank and the pig?
Not that I'd want to tell. No, all I can tell you is that he's such a masterful puppeteer, and Miss Piggy, for instance, was done by several people beforehand because she was just also on the stage for a number of things. People have asked me if anybody knew that she was going to be the star that she is, and I said no, we didn't, but she did, because once Frank did the karate chop, we were all done. That was it. We knew, and everybody's on the floor laughing. So consummate puppeteer and talented director as well now.
Yep. Yeah. I have a Franken Piggie. When we were doing the Muppet Show, you could tell that Frank occasionally would be having a hard day, didn't have enough coffee, something, and you'd be out on the floor and wrangling, and he'd look at you with the pig on, and he'd go, her neck's not on straight. Her neck's not on straight. I can't, her head's just, she's not focusing right. It's like, okay, Frank, give me a minute. I'll go in, I'll repin her neck. So we'd take her into the workshop and kind of hang out for a minute, not knowing full well that her neck was exactly where it should be. And you go, it's fine. It's just fine. So you wouldn't do a thing except spend a couple of minutes there talking to somebody, take it back out to him on set, give it to him. He'd put it on and go, oh, that's so much better. Thank you.
Frank was brilliant puppeteer. His Grover was so.
I love Grover.
Dear, how dear.
I love Grover.
We all do.
In the early couple of years, I could remember we were so hungry for material that we'd tape for hours, and Frank got silly one day, and he did like 17 takes because he would start giggling, and but Grover running off stage and backstage and getting exhausted was so dear, just such a dear character.
So I just heard via Karen, working behind the scenes, that Richard Hunt's sister is watching.
Oh, how wonderful!
Rachel, great. Hi,
yeah.
Rachel.
If you guys have any stories that you want to share about working with Richard, either collaborating with him to get a puppet quite right, or
yes, Richard was always late. That's what I remember. But I also remember that if you traveled anywhere with Richard, and particularly if you were on an airplane, by the time you got where you were going, he had entranced the entire group of people sitting in all the seats. The kids were all following him, singing songs. I mean, he was amazing. He was like the Pied Piper, and generous to a fault, talented. How much has he missed? So many of these people missed. It was such a fabulous group of people working together and having fun together.
Yep.
I have to say one quick thing about, having in my job more or less as the Jim Henson legacy part, seeing a lot of people coming to the museums and the exhibits. And so many of them have had sort of the same reaction when Caroly talked about Jim being the kind of humor that he had was not mean. It was all encompassing. It was forgiving, with this crazy cast of characters that he put together, very forgiving with them. And what most people seem to remember is having one show that they could watch with every generation, the young kids, middle-aged kids, older people. They all sort of enjoyed it, and it was the one thing they watched with a family. And I think that brought back a lot of really warm memories for everybody who comes to these exhibits.
Hey, Bert, wake up. Poke, poke. Yep. Bert, wake up. Poke, poke.
So I have a couple of questions that we're getting from the audience that I'll pose to you all. There have been a bunch of questions about building full body characters. and how that's different
Oh.
than building, puppets that go on your hand.
The first ones that we did were really the puppets. Well, Jim had done Thog. It was a big full body puppet. And that was done, I think, with Kermit and Donald, primarily. Caroly, I'm not sure. Thog, were you involved?
No, Kermit probably.
Yeah.
Connie came on later. Connie.
Right. And I know when I first started, one of the first things we did were the Ice Follies characters of all the Sesame Street characters.
Right.
And
They
I
did
had
them-
been used to
they did
doing,
them out of heavy padding, and the poor performers were just drenched in sweat. And then the
oh, they were fine, Caroly.
Come on, Caroly.
No, I'm saying when we started doing it, they had air inside the costumes. They weren't just padded pillows stuck.
No, they were boned. We boned them.
Yeah,
That was
they
the
were.
whole bone structure, a boning structure, which was something that we knew had to happen in order. First of all, it made them walk funny, and secondly, it kept air around their bodies, and it was a perfect way to get the bodies filled out. And we had some really wonderful performers in those first Ice Follies shows. Judy Slatke
Judy
Slatke went to be Alice, Snuffy's sister. Was one of the first ice skaters we had in the Ice Follies, doing characters there. And so really wonderful people that we've met along the way and that we stay in touch with.
Another question for you all, and I had the same question too, so there seems to be curiosity about this. I think I mentioned earlier that certainly when you all started, in around 1970 or so, there wasn't as well, not that there's such a track now, but I think the work of you all and the Jim Henson Company and all of the characters that came out of that really paved the way for an awareness of puppetry as something that people could do, right? There really wasn't that kind of awareness back then that there is now. And I think to a large degree, you all share some responsibility for that, for bringing that to people's awareness as a form of creative expression that people could engage in. So with that in mind, there are certainly people out there that are, as you may know, that are really itching to participate in that. So do you have any advice for folks that are looking to start making puppets and doing that professionally? What kind of skills do you need? How do you get good at it?
Caroly, if you've trained so many people, why don't you approach that question?
Me?
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. You.
Well, for one thing, Jim has sponsored all these international festivals, which have wonderful puppets from all over the world, and they're great places to go and see and learn and look into. I mean, that. And there's also the Puppeteers of America, and some of them are very good too. They're just, the puppeteers are having trouble now, given.
What's the most important thing that you have to be good at to be a successful puppet designer or builder?
I'd almost say collaboration.
That's good.
I really think that it takes a lot of people to make a good puppet. I mean, you've got to be able to work with the performer, with other people in the workshop. I mean, we always helped each other. If there was something that you couldn't get, there was always somebody who would be able to say, oh, okay, do it this way. Caroly was really good at finessing things, as was Bonnie. I mean, they're my mentors. I learned everything I know from them and from Dave Goles and Donald.
Yeah, well, also Sesame Street, the writers had a lot to do with it. The educators would pick a thing they wanted done, and then the writers would write to the point. And then you'd get this, I need to make a germ or something or other. And there's that other aspect, the word people, besides the physical puppet making.
This question just came out, and this is a good one to pose to all of you for posterity. Is there really such a thing as the Henson stitch?
Okay, let's get real here.
Well, everybody thinks the Henson stitch is something different.
The
Wait,
Henson stitch is-
aren't you all supposed to say yes, and it's a company secret?
Yes.
yeah, it is. Yeah.
What does it mean? What does the Henson stitch mean?
Well, I know that I did it differently from other people, so.
It's a stitch that
That's a tight, you have fleece and you have a nice tight stitch.
So that it's invisible.
Some people do it pretty cross crows, and I just did it continually tight and snug.
yeah, it just
Yeah.
you need
It's
a
a whip
fabric.
stitch.
You need a fabric, yes. You need
Yeah.
a fabric that has
Fleece.
some sort of thickness to it, and you sew from the back, and you just do a crossover stitch as close as you can, so that you're not disturbing the top of the fabric at all. So you
Right.
really those seams become invisible. But that's not something. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, that's something that was particularly Henson.
Right.
Nobody ever did it before.
Never.
I don't think I ever saw Jim do that.
that all of you did it very, very well. You know, I think
We had to.
Yeah, we had to. Those seams couldn't show.
Another question that came in is whether you think it's important to have some experience puppeteering in order to be a good puppet builder. And I know that Rollie, you've pitched in as a puppeteer in various contexts, probably not that much anymore, but you have. And Caroly, especially when you first started, you were doing some puppeteering. I'm not sure that you ever did much of that, Bonnie, but I'm curious about your perspective and how you know, do you need to be good at it to be able to be a good builder?
I hope not. I certainly wasn't. I think Jim would use me as a very, very last resort. I had always been I was in theater in college, and I was very interested in performing. And I found out this is not good for me. I was much better making things. I was not so good at performing. So I really didn't have any, I looked at people and said, why would you want to wear that? Why? I want to help you do whatever you do as best as I can, but I'm really not interested so much in doing it.
I have a funny picture that I'll share with you that that Caroly drew many years ago. Caroly, maybe you can explain what this might seem rude at first glance, but explain what this is a picture showing.
Yeah, well, this is my ideal puppeteer. The puppeteers are always looking at any rate they have been. Maybe they've changed it. The monitors were down on the floor, so the puppeteer needs to look at the monitor. And ideally, you have hands without too many fingers. Of course, the center hand there is evenly balanced. So you have a right hand, a left hand, and then the center one is the one with the head. And it would be useful to have the head low so it could look into the monitor. So I just thought that was a good idea.
It's a very funny idea.
It is a really funny picture.
And in a perfect world, they would all have three hands.
Right.
Oh, at least, yeah.
It's not easy being a puppeteer.
No, they get themselves into some very tight situations.
Yes, they do.
I think it's helped me to perform occasionally, to be able to know what the performer is feeling inside the head. I know that it was always funny because I'd build a puppet and then Jim would try and put his hand into it and it was too small. So I always tried to size it up a little to fit his hand. So I'm always very conscious of whether there's enough room in there for them and where their fingers are. And, you know, a lot of times if the puppet is very flexible, you've got to make sure that the hand can do the flexing that it has to. And people like Kevin did Elmo one way, Ryan has extra grips in his Elmo, so things change too.
I think Ryan is out there.
Hi, Ryan.
Well, I didn't puppeteer, but I must say I did try everything on my own hand. And certainly in the days when I was there, we were able to have access to the puppeteers. We were all pretty closely working together. So everybody got to try something on. You wanted, as I said, this is the vehicle for this performer. So you really want to make it work.
Yeah, it's a very intimate connection in a way, right?
Yes.
I'll ask a final question because we are at an hour, believe it or not, and we could go on and not get tired of hearing stories from you. But just as a closing question, just to ask how it feels to you at this point, really 50 years or close to 50 years later, to see characters that you built so long ago, or among colleagues so long ago, that are still so fresh and touching people so powerfully today, and new generations coming up encountering these characters that continue to connect with them. Does that, is that how does that feel to you? Does it feel, do you carry that around with you day to day, or does it not really kind of register?
It's great. It's great. And people still come to me and say, wow, which is fun. And not only that, moi is always in the crossword puzzles. It makes a difference.
It definitely makes a difference. I mean, I did Fizzgig so many years ago, and yet we've got Age of the Resistance, and so many people have said, oh my God, I love Fizzgig. He's my favorite character ever, and then to watch Fraggle Rock possibly come back. I mean, Caroly did Gobo, I did Wembley and Red, and they're going to hopefully come around for another generation, which is really cool, especially in this world, because that's Jim, that was a whole world unto itself.
They need Fraggles now.
They do need Fraggles.
I think it's very humbling in many ways to think that we were part of this imagination that Jim had that created so many interesting things, and to have been a part of helping that be realized for him. And for people to come up, as I said, at some of these exhibits and tell you how much it moved them, or how it inspired them. I think the inspiration of people, young people doing things. I just heard from someone in Australia who was very inspired by Jim's work, and we're always hearing from people who have been part of either the fan base or be inspired by the work that was done, whether it's writing, building, performing, all of that was part of it. So,
well, you were all mostly behind the scenes, but the magic that is still so much intact, and that is continues to make such a difference in people's lives today. We see it all around us. We see Sesame Street. We see the Fraggles coming back. The sort of iconic nature of the Muppets. It's not, and the Dark Crystal. I mean, all of this. It's still with us. It shows no sign of going anywhere. And it's not just the performers. It's everyone from coming together, and the work that you three are responsible for doing is so integral to that. So I just so glad that we have this audience here, and giving you a chance to talk to each other, and bringing this great work to everyone's attention. And thank you so much.
Thanks for letting us get together.
Thank you, Barbara. Yeah, we've had a good time.
Good.
We have to get together for real when this is all over.
Yes, next time in person.
Yes,
absolutely.
That would be good. That's the best.
As soon as possible, as soon as safe to do so.
Right. Thanks, Barbara.
Absolutely. Thank you, Barbara.
Thank you so much. Have a good night.
You too.
Good night.